Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be presenting my case under the topic All That Bloats Is Not Gas. Um, our patient is a 36-year-old gentleman. He's a farm worker from West Bengal with no known comorbidities and no history of addictions. He had come with history of easy fatigability and tiredness, um, and also associated with on and off leg swelling for the past 5 years. Incidentally, on visiting a clinician, he was diagnosed to have he was found to have a HB of 6.2 and has had several blood transfusions on 4 different occasions over the past 5 years. He was also initiated on oral therapy over the years, with which he was compliant, and yet he continued to have low values of hemoglobin over the past 5 years. He also gives a background history of recurrent abdominal pains and discomfort since childhood. So, uh, these abdominal pains were very less in frequency since his childhood. However, for the past 8 years, there was worsening of this abdominal pain, and he has had recurrent abdominal bloating and colicky pain associated with mucoid loose stools for the past 8 years. The frequency of these episodes was once in 2 to 3 months. There was no other history of vomiting, jaundice, or melena. He has also not identified any specific food triggers but has stopped dairy and gluten on advice from his doctors. On examination, the patient was conscious, alert, awake, and oriented to time, place, and person, hemodynamically stable and saturating well. He was found to have mild pallor with grade 1 clubbing. Otherwise, he had healing herpes labialis, and a general examination was otherwise normal. And systemic examination was grossly normal, not showing any significant findings. So, on summarizing, a 36-year-old gentleman, no known comorbidities, presented now with a 5 year history of symptoms of easy fatigability and on and off bilateral lower limb swelling, and having been transfused several times in the past, with a background history of 8 years of occasional abdominal bloating and loose stools with very less frequency. And examination wise, the patient was vitally stable with the pallor and grade 1 clubbing. One thing I had forgotten to mention previously was that he had mild hepatosplenomegaly. Save for that, the systemic examination was grossly normal. Problems we had identified at this point was anemia, which was refractory to treatment, and the background history of chronic GI complaints, which was persistent. Investigations wise, the patient was found to have a HB of 5.4, MCV of 62.2 with anisocytosis and a reticulocyte proliferation index of 2.295. Iron was 10 with a TIBC of 304, qualifying this as an iron deficiency anemia with very low iron stores with ferritin of 0.1. As the patient has had long-standing GI symptoms, we thought the probable disease process involving this iron deficiency anemia was either due to decreased iron absorption from the gut or due to blood loss from the continued blood loss from the GI tract. So the differentials we had considered at this point was either a H. pylori or an autoimmune gastritis if we are thinking of an upper GI pathology. For small bowel, we thought of celiac disease, any other malabsorption syndrome, small bowel Crohn's, or an ileocecal tuberculosis. For large bowel disease, we had thought of a Crohn's or a parasitic infestation, also causing malabsorption. So to qualify the differentials, we had done these investigations. Stool occult blood was positive with SRP negative. Anti-TTG was done and was found negative, effectively ruling out celiac disease. Fetal calprotectin was moderately elevated, 392.96. And upper GI scopy and lower GI scopy findings were actually not were vague. Like there was mild chronic gastritis, mild chronic duodenitis with no H. pylori, and minimal active ileitis and colitis. So at this point, since the scopies were clear but stool occult blood was positive, we went ahead and did a magnetic resonance enterography. This showed multifocal skip lesions present in the distal jejunum and proximal mid and distal ileum. Terminal and ileocecal junction were not involved and few mesenteric lymph nodes were seen. These are features suggestive of active Crohn's disease. Hence, we obtained a diagnosis of small bowel Crohn's disease in our patient. So, in this, these are the learning points I would like to draw your attention to. One being anemia refractory to treatment, isolated small bowel Crohn's, and small bowel visualization. If we look at anemia refractory to treatment, there could be many reasons for this, like coexisting disease interfering with the marrow response, and patient not being compliant with the medication. Patient is taking the medication, but it's not being absorbed, like maybe malabsorption syndromes or autoimmune gastritis, which is where we were focusing. Also, continued blood loss from the GI, like a bleeding peptic ulcer or any hereditary telangiectasias or hemangiomas in the gut. So the next thing I would like to talk about is isolated small bowel Crohn's disease. So Crohn's disease, as we know, is an idiopathic inflammatory bowel disease. It can involve any part of the GI tract, and most common part involved is the ileocecal junction, which is what we most likely look for. But if you remember, in our patient, that is negative. 30% of the patients present with only isolated small bowel involvement, which is very difficult to visualize, and hence they prove a diagnostic dilemma. And the symptoms of isolated small bowel Crohn's are also missed because they are milder in nature. If you can look at studies show that isolated small bowel Crohn's have higher percentage of stricture formation, a higher Lewis score, and a lower Harvey-Bradshaw index. So what is Harvey-Bradshaw index? It is present on the left side. We see HBI is indicative of symptomatology. Lower HBI means that symptoms are very mild, and Lewis score on the right side is the visualized objective inflammation present in Crohn's, and a higher Lewis index indicates that the disease process is more severe. Hence, the Lewis score is actually also used as an indicator to measure the severity and likelihood of complications. So, a lower HB score as well as a higher Lewis score in small bowel Crohn's points to the fact that a patient could be presenting with any amount of vague GI symptoms which are not probably considered significant, but they will have an active disease process which will lead to worse outcomes for the same patient, which is, if you can see, that is how our patient also presented. Now we'll go to small bowel diagnostics. As we know, gastroscopy visualizes only the up until the second part of the duodenum, and colonoscopy only up until 5 centimeters of the terminal ileum. A lot of small bowel actually goes routinely unvisualized. So what kind of patients do we choose the small bowel diagnostics is for patients with stool occult blood positivity but clear scopies and having vague GI symptoms. We could think of visualizing the small bowel. Even patients with small bowel tumors, celiac disease, even patients with motility disorder, small bowel is better visualized. There are two types of visualization modalities, radiological as well as endoscopic. Radiological includes barium nail follow through. In this picture, you could see a stricture constricting the part of the bowel pointed out with the arrows. CT enterography also showing a stricture, and MR enterography. When we look at endoscopic procedures, there's push enteroscopy, which is just like an upper GI scopy, but further push down to visualize the small intestine. There are other methods like balloon enteroscopy, where it is in the enteroscope is inserted into the small bowel as you would insert a curtain into a rod, which means that the small intestine is plicated around the tube, and hence this would take several hours. Spiral enteroscopy is where there is a the tube which is spiral in nature and can negotiate the curves of the intestine, and wireless capsule enteroscopy, which is the newest, where the patient ingests the capsule and there is cameras which take images of the small bowel. So summarizing, in treatment refractory anemia, we should consider causes like malabsorption and continued GI loss. And in patients who present to us with vague abdominal symptoms and occult GI bleeding with clear scopies, we can suspect isolated Crohn's disease. And as only a limited part of the small bowel is visualized using the upper and lower GI scopies, if we have high index of suspicion, we could consider any other alternate modalities for the visualization of small bowel. Now, what is happening to our patient is that he is referred to the GC clinic where he was initiated on prednisolone and immunomodulation for with azathioprine for definite therapy of Crohn's. Thank you.
Thank you, Christianis. I think that's a good lesson to be learned that all that bloats in OPD is not always gas. Do any of our faculty have any questions to ask? Christianis, what were the main things that made you think that it's not just gas, and what were the danger signs in this patient?
Ma'am, the recurrent anemia itself and the stool occult blood being positive, those in examination findings, there was grade 1 clubbing, which is also seen in inflammatory bowel disease. Otherwise, otherwise investigation wise, ma'am, I would like to also point out that the fecal calprotectin was high. Now, fecal calprotectin is a test that is routinely used to differentiate between inflammatory bowel disease and irritable bowel syndrome. And several meta-analysis has shown that the sensitivity uh, of this test, if we keep the cutoff at 250, is 84% with a specificity of also 84%. Hence, the fecal calprotectin of again 392, which was well above the 250 cutoff, also was very suggestive of the fact that something structural was going on rather than something functional.
So it's more of a rule out test, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Christianis. If there are there any questions? Yeah. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
The patient's history, his abdominal pain was for many years, and even anemia was detected 5 years ago. Is this kind of history compatible with the diagnosis of Crohn's disease? Untreated Crohn's for going on for years, and he has not developed malabsorption, weight loss, except for persistent refractory anemia. How often do you see a presentation like this, Christianis?
Sir, I'm actually not sure, so I'll read up and get back to you on this.
Christianis, have you done a biopsy of the jejunum or any of the places where the intestine was inflamed?
Yes, there was a biopsy done from the upper GI and the lower GI scopies, which was showing mild chronic inflammation of the esophagus, mild gastritis without H. pylori, and mild active ileitis and colitis. But since the small bowel investigation we had done was just imaging, we were not able to obtain a biopsy. An enteroscopic procedure was actually not done on this particular patient.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Manna, do you want to say anything about the case?
I think from Oshisa's question, I think mild IBD, especially the small bowel Crohn's, can present like a very chronic history, sir, without much. There can be some weight loss and malabsorption. We've had a similar patient in M5 long back who, as a child from 12 years of age, he had symptoms like this. Just some mild colicky abdominal pain and came at around 20, 22 years and we are diagnosed small bowel Crohn's. And the only symptom he had was this mild, vague abdominal pain and stunted growth. So it is something that can go on as a chronic thing and present as a very subclinical thing, sir.
Thank you, Manna. Thank you very much for the clarification.
Thanks.
So, thank you, Christianis. We'll move on to the last case, the Devil's Grin, from Medicine 5 by Shreya.
So I've titled my presentation for today as The Devil's Grin. So coming to the history of this patient, so this is a 20-year-old female who, following a feud in the family, impulsively took 10 seeds from the Eti plant and ingested it. So within a few hours, she developed tonic-clonic movements of the bilateral upper and lower limbs, which was associated with arching of the back. There was no facial grimacing that was noted, no fasciculations that they noted at that point of time. And she was brought to the hospital 3 hours after consumption of the seeds. So on examination, this patient was conscious, alert, and oriented to time, place, and person. Vital signs at the time of examination was a pulse of 92 per minute, BP of 120 by 80 mmHg, respiratory rate of 22 per minute, maintaining saturation on room air. Pallor was present, however, there was no icterus, clubbing, cyanosis, lymphadenopathy, or edema. In the casualty, it has been noted that she had an arched posture. However, she was awake at that whole point of time. There was no loss of consciousness, and there were muscle fasciculations that were noted of the upper and the lower limbs. Pupils at the time of examination in casualty was mydriatic, around 4 mm in diameter, and it was reactive to light. So this was the posture that the patient had at the time of presentation to the casualty. So in ward, when she had come, she had actually had she did not have this mydriasis at that point of time. Her pupils were equal and reactive at that point of time. Other than that, everything else was similar. We had showed her a picture of the Eti seeds, and she had actually confirmed that these were the seeds that she had ingested. So our final diagnosis here is quite straightforward. So this is a case of strychnine poisoning. So talking a little bit about the toxin strychnine. So it is an alkaloid that is derived from the seeds of the tree Strychnus nux vomica. So initially in Germany, it was used as a rodenticide and as laxative pills. So at this point of time, anyways, in the West, it's been banned as a rodenticide. So the most common route of poisoning in the West is because of adulteration of street drugs like cocaine, marijuana. So the mechanism of toxicity in strychnine is that it is a competitive antagonist of glycine, which is an inhibitor neurotransmitter in the brain, spinal cord, and brainstem. So in the spinal interneurons, postsynaptic interneurons, glycine is a major neurotransmitter. So when this is inhibited, the inhibitory interneurons stop transmitting, and thus there is continuous contraction of the muscles. So usually the clinical features occur after 15 to 30 minutes of ingestion. Now coming to the clinical features that have been documented with strychnine poisoning, there can be muscle spasm, twitches, hypersensitivity to stimuli like light, sound. What is classically described as a feature of strychnine poisoning is the awake seizure that they come with. So these are tonic-clonic movements with retained awareness. They also have been known to have a sustained spasm of the facial muscles, which is known as risus sardonicus or the sardonic smile, or it's also known as the devil's smile. So opisthotonus is also present in strychnine poisoning. So coming to complications that you will expect with a patient with strychnine poisoning, you can have sustained contractions, and this is mainly the reason for all the complications that occur in strychnine poisoning. So sustained contraction of the muscle will lead to hyperthermia, rhabdomyolysis, compartment syndrome. Because of the sustained muscle contraction, you can also have lactic acidosis. So most common cause of death in these patients is because of respiratory paralysis. And there are other neuromuscular sequelae that have been described, such as prolonged weakness, myalgia, myoedema, and anterior tibial edema. So treatment mainly involves maintaining airway, breathing, and circulation. Ideally, these patients should be managed in a quiet, dark room because of the fact that they're hypersensitive to stimuli. So the cornerstone in their treatment, because of the fact is the control of muscle activity, because excessive muscle contraction is what leads to most of their complications. So the benzodiazepines are the mainstay of treatment. So you can give either diazepam or lorazepam, and you can repeat doses every 15 minutes until there is cessation of rigidity. If the muscle contractions do not respond to these, then you can consider giving barbiturates, or you can give them propofol and intubate them. So we'll have to reassess patients, and usually they are put on a benzodiazepine maintenance dose. And because of the sustained muscle contractions, they have pain, and opioid analgesics are commonly prescribed for that. A short-acting opioid, it'll be a good choice, like fentanyl. So this is one of the first case reports that have actually used diazepam in the treatment of strychnine poisoning. Prior to 1969, the most common treatment of strychnine poisoning was barbiturates. And so barbiturates were also used in the treatment of tetanus. So when diazepams came, basically they had better recovery rates and better mortality rates because of diazepam, because it has a less hypnotic effect and has a prominent muscle relaxant effect. Whereas barbiturates had an increased risk of anoxia, and there was already the main cause of death in strychnine is because of a respiratory arrest and continued respiratory muscle paralysis. So in our patient, her ABG showed lactic acidosis with a lactate of 13.7. And we monitored her for rhabdomyolysis as well. And we monitored her creatinine. So creatinine was stable. However, the CPK was gradually rising day by day. So the treatment that we gave her in casualty, she was responsive to IV midazolam. So we had put her on benzodiazepines maintenance dose, which was lorazepam 1 mg Q4H we started with. Then we gradually tapered and stopped the dosage in 3 days. So she was kept in a dark room as well, and she was aggressively hydrated. We calculated a risk prediction for heme pigment induced AKI, and that was 3, which was less than 5. So that meant that a heme pigment induced AKI in her, the chances of it developing is very low because it was less than 5. She thankfully did not develop any other complications. So the learning points that I had from this presentation was that benzodiazepines are the cornerstone for treatment of strychnine poisoning, and that we have to look out for complications such as rhabdomyolysis and compartment syndrome.
Thank you, Shreya. It's an interesting case. Any of the faculty have any questions for Shreya? Is this tree very commonly seen in Vellore, Shreya? And does anybody prescribe to this? Is it part of any native medication?
Yeah, Tina, I'll answer the question on behalf of Shreya. It's actually very common in and around Vellore. It's used as a cattle poison, and in native medicines, you originally, even in English in allopathy, it used to be used as an inotrope. So people are aware, I think, of its toxicity, and they use it like to commit deliberate self-harm.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks for the clarification. Thank you, Shreya. So with that, just in case we end for today, I hope it's been a... Sorry, does anybody have anything else to say? Sir, you're not very clear. Yeah.
Can you?
Yes, we can hear
Anybody
you now.
speaking? Yeah, I was not speaking anyway. Thank you, Tina, for wonderfully chairing this session. I really want to thank all the PGs. You all stuck to your time. That was quite amazing. And each of the cases were interesting and wonderfully presented. I'll just remind all our faculties for their feedback. It will be helpful for the PGs to improve their presentations. And I think there is a quiz for the PGs at the end. I think somebody would be posting it. We are just noting all the marks of all the PGs for the quizzes, just to see how you have been faring over a period of time. So make sure that you all attempt the quiz. It's kept simple. If you have attended the session, it should not be difficult. So that will be posted, and we will be noting all the marks that you scored at the end of your quiz. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. So the quiz has been uploaded for all the PGs to all the registrars can attempt it, and the feedbacks have been sent to all faculty. Please send in your feedbacks. Thank you and see you next week.